Have a looming deadline for a major research project? Whether you're an undergrad writing your first paper or an established author with multiple publications, navigating the research ecosystem can be daunting. That's why the libraries at Columbia University have created From Books to Bytes, Navigating the Research Ecosystem, a set of online resources that define the research cycle, provide you with practical strategies, and guide you through the vast resources available to you at Columbia. The stages of the research cycle recommend that you plan, explore, manage, draft, preserve, and share your work. These stages are not necessarily linear, but they are all connected and all necessary to produce your best research work. Archives and primary sources.
Hello, I'm Alexis Hagadorn, Head of Conservation.
And I'm Ty Jones, Curator for American History at the Rare Book and Manuscript Library.
We're both librarians at the Columbia University Libraries. In this video, we'll look at some examples of items from the archival collections. We'll explain how they came to be created and discuss some of the types of materials they may contain.
We are here now in Columbia's Rare Book and Manuscript Library on the 6th floor of Butler Library. This is the university's largest archive. It is visited by around 4,000 researchers each year and holds 50 miles of archival documents and more than 500,000 rare books.
To guide our conversation, we've selected 4 different artifacts from Columbia's collections. Each represents a type of unique or rare document that a researcher might find in an archive. We have a 3-dimensional object, in this case a cast of President Lincoln, a book from the 18th century, a newspaper from 1859, and an album of Civil War era photographs.
Alexis, shouldn't we be wearing gloves?
Actually, that's one misconception about working with archival materials. We usually don't use gloves when handling paper and books because it's a safer way to access them. Well, it is important to use gloves with photographs, for example. When you visit the library, you will get information about the practices to follow. And this is all one way that an archive is different from a museum, because here we're able to actually touch and examine objects by following careful handling practices.
Over the past few years, we've worked to make Columbia's archives more welcoming to students and researchers at every level. And now teaching and learning happen here every day. So we're looking now at one of the collection's most striking objects. This is a life mask created for or of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. Alexis, now we are wearing gloves. Why are we wearing gloves to handle this object?
Because there are salts and oils in skin that will offset onto surfaces when we're handling metal that could cause it to corrode.
So these life masks were actually a common object in the mid-19th century. Public figures, politicians, famous writers would have their likeness taken in plaster. Later on, it would be cast into bronze. And this was really the closest the American public could come to seeing the faces of their public figures in the era before photography. This one was taken on the day that he had won the Republican nomination in 1860. And you can see in the hands, they've kept this piece of broomstick. And the story goes that he had shaken so many hands in congratulation for having won the nomination that his hand was spasming too violently to hold the plaster still. So they had to have him hold this broomstick. And later, these hands actually became the model for the statue in the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., although they removed the broom handle for that.
So with that plaster cast, we know that was taken in 1860, like you mentioned. But then we know that these bronze casts were made from that original much later. So the set that we have here is one of many that are more or less identical. But still, when we look at ours, we can see evidence of its use and wear over past decades that would distinguish it, like a little chip here and some abrasion on the surface. And when we have objects like this in our collections, we can prevent that kind of wear from happening in the future by having specially constructed housings that help to hold these rather heavy objects securely in storage so that they can't bump into one another.
Besides being such a striking object, and every time we use this in a class, it's always the first thing that students notice, but it really does give you a sense of how popular culture and public life would have worked in the United States in the days before photography. So, Alexis, here we are looking at a rare book from the late 18th century. This is the constitutions of the several independent states of America. And you can see this actually belonged to Alexander Hamilton. So this is a notable copy of this book. But of course, this book has been digitized and you can find the text online. So why would a researcher come to an archive to look at a book that they could see online?
Well, I think every copy is unique from a book produced in this period. The type was set by hand. Mistakes might have been made, and a printer would identify those and change the type during the press run. And so you could have different states of the edition as they were produced. They may have changed paper stock, so we're looking at examples of handmade paper because that's how it was made at the time. So every copy is unique in that way, but also because printers tended not to bind all the copies that they produced. So books were sold in unbound sheets and then bound by the purchaser. So that means that by looking at the binding, we also learn something about the provenance of this copy. We know it has Hamilton's signature, among some others, but we can see from the cover that it's an 18th century, typical of an early American book binding. And so that helps us connect this binding with Hamilton's ownership, that this is most likely the binding he would have held to read the book. So in 2015, we brought this book to the Conservation Lab, as you remember.
Yes.
And at the time, the spine was damaged, and every time the book was open for classroom teaching, leather was liable to fall off. The boards were detached from the book, and so they weren't protecting these important pages that have the signatures on them. So when it came to conservation, like any treatment of an important book, there'd be a discussion between the conservators who can say what can be done, and you, the curator, talking about what's ideal for this book and the way that you use it. So we made a decision not to replace the original leather because that would have required us to do more alteration of the cover and actually change the original a lot more. And instead chose to just use a paper fill of where the spine leather used to be. And the leather itself is preserved off the book so that people can study it if they need to.
Right, so we use this book almost every year for classes that were coming in and studying the era of the American Revolution. And I remember the cover fell off, and we brought it to you. So this is Alexander Hamilton's book, but even if it was owned by someone who was not famous, it would be of interest to historians and researchers, because when you look at a book that someone has marked up and may have underlined the passage or put an exclamation point or made a margin note, you get a sense of how a book was read at the time. And that's something that you really can't get through either contemporary editions or just seeing one copy that's happened to have been digitized.
Right. And this one has another interesting note, too.
It says, Mr. Hamilton returned me this book instead of mine own, which he had borrowed, he said was mislaid. So this book actually was owned by Alexander Hamilton. He had borrowed a copy from another well-known founding father, Robert Morris, and had lost it and had to give him his own copy.
And that's also testified on the end sheet, which wouldn't really have been part of the text. So it's really part of the artifact instead. And it's a record of this relationship between two important figures at that time. So looking at an original newspaper in an archive, I'm always conscious of its ephemeral status. That a newspaper is produced on a tight deadline. It's not really meant to last for a long time. And so the materials would have been chosen to be the most economical and easily available. But at the time that this newspaper was produced, paper was still mainly made by rags, so linen and cotton fibers.
And is that why it looks so new? I mean, it really has not yellowed, it's not crumbling. The pages can be turned without falling apart.
Right, and what comes in a couple of decades after this is that it's much more common for paper to be made using ground wood pulp, which means pulp made from trees instead of fibers from rags. And that type of pulp produces a paper that quickly becomes brittle and darkens. And that's something we've probably all seen if we've tried to save newspaper clippings. So in this case, the light color of the paper and its overall flexibility and relative strength actually testify to its age.
And when we think about why this particular issue has been saved, I think it is about this engraved image at the top, which shows the scene of the execution of John Brown, the anti-slavery activist who raided a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry in Virginia in an attempt to incite a revolt of enslaved people. But as your eye drifts around the page, you also see, here's a chapter from Charles Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities, which was being serialized at this time in newspapers around the country. So it really gives you a sense of all of the different things that were occurring in the day-to-day life of readers of this newspaper on December 10th, 1859.
Right. And what's the poem over there?
There's a little poem that's called The Fanatic's Song, and it's an anti-John Brown poem. So another thing that's especially interesting about this newspaper is it's a Democratic newspaper published in the North. So this is a newspaper that's against abolitionism, but is published in a state that will soon become a major Union state during the Civil War. So this is an example of a very idiosyncratic source that most researchers wouldn't really think of before coming to the archive. But if you found this and you browsed through it, you actually could get any number of really interesting research ideas from seeing how this information was presented.
So I think photo albums are really fascinating kinds of artifacts. And in this case, we have a commercially made book that was prepared so that an owner could fill it with the things he or she wanted to have inside. And in this case, we have a lot of albumin photographs, which are photographs. It's a process that was popular between 1850 and 1900. And the photograph itself was produced on a rather thin piece of paper that then was mounted to a card. And these would have been distributed from the photographer's studio in standard size formats. So this format is called a carte de visite, which is a French term for a calling card. And it was because family or associates could exchange these with each other. And this album has been prepared so that the creator of the album could insert the photographs. It's been prepared with special slots for that size. And the creator of this album has included some color prints, and there's some needlework samples along with the photographs. So in studying the album, it's not only the photographs themselves or the unique objects, the individual objects that we're looking at, but how it was compiled by a creator. And so that makes them much more complex objects.
Yeah, what's really interesting about this document is we have photographs by Matthew Brady, who was the most famous American photographer of the time. But those images you could find online if you were interested in using them for research. What's unique here is that we have them in the context of this photo album. This album comes from a collection of a very well-known abolitionist and anti-slavery activist and supporter of Abraham Lincoln and the Union War effort. So here we have them in his photo album, and he's even written his own captions, or someone in his family has written captions to each photo. So we really have evidence here of ownership and readership, and you can almost imagine the family looking at these photos together at home, and it really brings them to life as a source.
Right. And by coming to see the original, you also understand the size, the format. You can experience the glossiness on the surface of the photo, which helps to identify the process if you know what you're looking for, and look at how the creator dealt with the album. You know, we see as we go through areas with much more wear from heavy use, where the photographs are, and then other areas later in the volume that aren't even full. So we can consider the project of the creator and whether they completed it or not.
Right. Yeah, it's totally different to see it used like this. It really lets you imagine how people at the time would have interacted with these really famous images that we're used to seeing in museums in a totally different context. Columbia students and faculty, as well as researchers worldwide, are invited to come and work in the library's many archival collections. you can refer to the Columbia Library's website for up-to-date information. As a first step, we would recommend spending some time searching through the finding aids on the library's archival collections portal.
And while we highly encourage you to come to the archives in person, there's several digital collections on the Columbia University Library's website. So please feel free to explore our holdings.
Columbia's archives are an excellent source for research ideas and student projects. Countless stories in these collections still remain to be discovered and told.
We hope this video has offered some insight into the research cycle and ways in which we can examine archives and primary sources. We encourage you to familiarize yourself with the other videos and resources in the From Books to Bytes series, as they all delve deeper into the resources available to you at the Columbia University Libraries. And remember, you can always consult with your subject librarian and visit our Ask a Librarian service on the Columbia Library's website.